had all his faculties and that he was part of this and that he really enjoyed your first two books.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Bob's daughter reached out to me, and she was able to connect us over email. And Bob gave me some of his recollections of the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea and his attack on the Japanese battleship Musashi. And I quoted him in my most recent book, the third book in my trilogy.
Well, what a job that was.
Yeah.
You deserve all the accolades that are coming to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's so gratifying to be able to actually see these events through the eyes of people who were there.
Yeah.
My first book and my next book were on the War of 1812, and so if you want the eyewitness accounts, you got to go back into the archives for those.
I read your 6 frigates when it first came out, Ian, and it was also, very, very good. And a little harder to find veterans from that era.
yeah, that's a more difficult challenge, finding people still around from that one.
Yeah. Well, we're incredibly lucky. We have people like Bob Freligh still with us that can give us the personal story. So appreciate both of you being on today.
Thank you very much.
So the way we're going to structure this, Sean will be giving the introduction here in a minute, welcoming people, and a little bit of announcements about some other things coming up on Veterans Breakfast Club programs. Todd, our executive director, could not make it this morning, but Sean is highly capable. And then he'll turn it over to me. I'll do a little further introductions of the two of you. And then I have a PowerPoint just to have some structure to the discussion and use the slides that Libby, Bob's daughter, sent me, and then the ones I came up with. For the most part, the idea is to focus in on the Battle of the, and I'm glad you gave me the pronunciation there, Ian, because I struggled with it. The Sibuyan Sea, is that the right? Right. And the sinking of the Musashi, right? And of course, the rest of Bob's story as well. Would like you, Ian, if you're okay with this, just as we walk through, so I use a lot of maps, as you'll see, sort of how the Battle of the Philippine Sea came about. I'm sorry, the Battle of Leyte Gulf came about, starting with the Battle of the Philippine Sea as the sort of predecessor event, right? Which Bob and the Franklin were part of. But we won't dwell on any of those too much. We'll try to get to the main story, which is Bob's story of his torpedo run on the Musashi, subsequent 47 days. I think that was that a Philippine luxury?
Sorry to interrupt. We're ready to go live. We're 9:01. Sorry to interrupt. Hold on one sec.
No, we're good.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club Greatest Generation Live for Tuesday, March 22nd. My name is Sean Hall. I'm Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're a small nonprofit I shouldn't say small, because we've gone nationwide, and we are bringing in people from all around the world now. So we are a good-sized nonprofit stationed in Western PA, whose mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. A wonderful program lined up for you this morning with host Glenn Flickinger, who I'll hand off to here in just a minute. We'll be having both guests, World War II veteran Bob Freligh join us, as well as author Ian Toll. Very excited for this conversation. I'm going to give a couple quick updates here before we dive into the subject matter, but we're so excited to have both of you gentlemen joining us for the conversation this morning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so you all can see what we have coming up with the VBC. Really, it was a busy week here in the office. But yesterday we had on surviving members from the USS Pueblo, the gentlemen who were captured during Vietnam. It was sort of a part 2 for us. This is here, right here. There we go. Obviously this morning here, but that was a great conversation last night with the POWs from the USS Pueblo. Here's our conversation today. Wednesday, tomorrow morning, we will have Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall coming back on. The museum curator, Mike Kraus, and collections manager, Lisa Petita, joining us to talk about the collection. It's a huge collection over there at Soldiers and Sailors. It's one of the biggest, it says here, the largest veterans memorial in the US. They've joined us once before. They're coming back to show us more because there's so much there that we had to bring them back on for a second time. And then actually Saturday night is missing on here because it's a members only event. Saturday night is our Jeopardy round 2. We had a great time in round 1. And if you missed round 1, you need to become a member, which you can by going to our website, veteransbreakfastclub.org. You can see right up at the top, join as a member. It's $36 per year. You get a magazine, you get discounts on all kinds of VBC merchandise. You get invited to our members only events, just like this Saturday. And if you missed that first Jeopardy, it was a great time. One team was down the entire time and brought it back and won in Final Jeopardy. It was very exciting and fun because not only do we do the trivia, but we have a lot of historical context for all of it. So it's a big, fun, educational program. So join us Saturday night. If you're not a member, join up, and then you're welcome to come join us for that program. Then next Monday, Annette Grunsteth and Ruth Crocker, 2 authors, will be joining us to talk about their families' letters during Vietnam. And then coming up March 29th, we will be joined by Kim Mitchell. This will be a live program, our first live program of 2022. It will be simulcast, so you can join online if you are unable to join in person, but this will be March 29th, 6 to 8:30 p.m. again at Soldiers and Sailors. Kim's story is not one to be missed. She was found in Vietnam on her dead mother, a terrible tragedy. She was picked up by a Vietnamese soldier, carried miles and miles to an orphanage where she was adopted by an American soldier, came here and eventually ended up enlisting in the Navy, very accomplished Navy career. She'll be joining us to talk about her service. So lots of great things coming up with VBC, starting with today. Glenn, this is a great program you have lined up for us.
Well, thanks very much. I didn't do much of the work. I was very, very fortunate through these connections are funny through a friend of mine who, in fact, I see he's on the in the room on the Zoom. Keith Kuhn, the Kuhn family knew the Freligh family somewhere in the past. I can't remember exactly, but Keith has listened to some of our programs, and he knows I'm a aficionado, I think the actual real word is nerd about World War II history. I think that's an official designation that I've earned. And so he introduced me to Bob's sisters. And through that, excuse me, we made the connection and then learned that Bob had been quoted in Ian Toll's last book, Twilight of the Gods, and then we made that connection, and Ian Toll was very, very kind to agree to spend an hour or so with us this morning. So that's just how it all came about. So without further ado, let me introduce Ian Toll first. You see him up there on the screen. Ian has become one of the most preeminent World War II historians, really kind of very quickly, I would say, in the last decade or so. And we're going to talk about his 3 books, but particularly his last book in just a minute. So if you just would say hello and wave your hand, Ian, so people can see who you are. There you are.
Good morning.
Okay. Thank you, sir. And then, of course, the hero of the day, as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Bob Freligh. Bob, if you would wave your hand so people know who you are on the screen. Okay. Bob, you've already read some about. He's a veteran of the Pacific War. Bob is 100 years young. and you'll just see how young he is here as we go through this discussion. And we're going to basically tell his story with Mr. Toll's help here about his life as an Avenger pilot, a torpedo bomber pilot in the 1944 sort of time frame, and his involvement in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which then gets a little more detailed in his role in helping to sink the largest battleship ever built, the Musashi. So I'm going to take over the screen here. Give me just a second, and we'll move on. Okay, everybody see that okay? My technical gifts are improving as Sean teaches me program by program. Ian, your background I found fascinating, partly because I started my life as an investment banker and commercial banker. But Mr. Toll was educated at Georgetown University, then at Harvard University or Kennedy Center of Government, I think it is. He went to work as a speechwriter, political speechwriter, and then worked on Wall Street as an equity research analyst for quite some time. And then his first book was called Six Frigates, A History of the Founding of the U.S. Navy. When was that published, Ian?
That was published in 2006.
2006, okay. And then, as I think we all know, those of us who read a lot of World War II, he switched to World War II and has written this trilogy of 3 books about the history of the Pacific War, which are just fascinating reads. Just you're to be deeply congratulated for taking a story that can be very detailed and hard to get your hands around and making it understandable for the average person with some historical interest. So if I could ask a couple of questions, Ian, that's quite a pivot from Wall Street equity analyst to to one of our leading World War II historians.
Yes, it is.
How does that come about?
Well, really during the dot-com blitz of the late 90s, I was really excited to be working in that area. It seemed like everything was happening, everything was moving. And then we're going back into history here, but you may remember that the NASDAQ peaked in March 2000.
Right.
Began to fall precipitously as the first dot-com bubble popped. And so I was, I was in that career, but the companies that I had been covering, something you do as a research analyst, you put ratings on stocks, and those companies started to basically go out of business. So it was sort of a painful unwinding, and then we had 9/11, and I decided I just wanted to do something else with my life, at least for a while. And I had always been an avid reader of history. I'd read pretty much everything there was to read on that subject of the founding of the U.S. Navy, just as a hobby, really. And I came to believe that there was a book that hadn't yet been written, and that I might as well take a stab at writing it myself. And I really had just conceived that as something I would do on the side after 9/11, during that recession. If I could get it published, it would be terrific. And then I would go back to my ordinary life. But that book was a success. And so my editor was encouraging me to continue. And we were discussing possible future books. And I said, well, another subject that I've read deeply into, and I think there's something to be written, is on the Pacific War, the naval war in particular in the Pacific. And he said, sold, I'll give you a book contract for that. And so that was a 1-book idea, and then that turned into 3. And here I am 20 years later, and now this is what I do for a living.
Well, we're very, very happy for us World War II nerds, my official designation. I'm very, very happy that you went through that career change, because you've written some beautiful books. And of course, the one we're going to focus on today is this one, Twilight of the Gods, the last book, 44 and 45. I'm just kind of curious, Ian, why Twilight of the Gods? What's the meaning behind that title?
Well, Twilight of the Gods, got it damn wrong, is many of the opera fans on the call will know, was the third of Wagner's Ring cycle. And that's an opera really about a sort of a final battle of the gods, implying a sort of a dramatic fall of an ancient order. From the Japanese point of view, their last year of that war really was a kind of Gadamarong for them, a climactic fall, a final battle. And then in addition, twilight implies either a rising or setting sun. Of course, this rising sun is the symbol of ancient symbol of Japan. And then gods really, I mean, their religious context is a polytheistic religion, Shinto, in which they have a myriad of different gods, Shinto gods. And so for all of those reasons, I just thought that was a good fit.
A beautiful explanation, and it's like you're writing, Ian. It's somewhat poetic in the way you're able to connect all those dots together. So very good. Let me just stop right there before we get into Bob's story and see anything, Sean, in the chat room or anybody with a hand up that would like to ask Mr. Toll a question.
Nothing in the chat as of yet, but anybody here is welcome. Please put any questions into the chat. We'll make sure to get to them during the program. And also on the Facebook and YouTube side, if you're watching there, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring that to bring them into the Zoom program.
Great. Thank you, Sean. We just want to remind our audience that we try to make this as interactive as possible. So put any questions in the chat or put your hand up on the Zoom, and we'll find a place to answer, get your question posed. Okay. So let me go back to the share. I'm becoming quite adroit at this, I think. So just a tiny bit of a history lesson here with this map. And please, Ian or Bob, please comment on this. But I mean, this is sort of the war in the Pacific in one big map in 30 seconds, right? And the part of it that I personally like that it depicts is it shows the two primary campaigns within the war in the Pacific. In the South, not quite fully on the map, is where we start really with at least the offensive part of the American war in the Pacific, with the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, and then MacArthur's campaign up the New Guinea coast, and then finally into the Philippines. And then the other part depicted is, of course, the Central Pacific campaign led by Admiral Nimitz, the Marines for the most part, and the various battles that occur there, meeting up really kind of in Okinawa on our way to Japan, right? So just a quick reminder for everybody as sort of the context of this. Ian or Bob, any thoughts on that?
This is Bob. I'm always surprised that the Navy was able to do what they did and that you now show on the map.
Yeah, but the map doesn't give you a projection for the vast distances involved. I've flown across that pond a few times on business, and it's a long way back and forth. And to think of the technology we had in terms of the type of air power and naval ships at the time, it's just amazing, right? And Bob, you were an integral part of that campaign. This is a picture of the USS Franklin, the carrier that you served on,
Yes,
Bob.
Yeah. Yep.
So
Big
bring back a few memories.
Oh, it sure does. Yeah.
So this is the Franklin leaving its dry dock where it was built and actually commissioned in, I believe, early 1944. It's CV-13, so the 13th carrier built by the U.S. Navy. Anybody ever concerned about that number there, Bob?
I've never heard that. No, I never. We just went ahead. 13 might have been just lucky.
Lucky 13. I like
I
that.
take 13.
All right.
Well, considering the career of that ship, I guess you could say that she was lucky. She was lucky to survive
Right.
the attack. I believe I'm sure a lot of people in the audience know, about 6 months after the action that we're going to be discussing today, the Franklin was involved in carrier raid on the Japanese homeland, and she was bombed by a Japanese plane, and a series of very destructive secondary fires began in the ship, in the hangar deck in particular. And the ship was almost lost. The casualties to the crew, I believe, were north of 800 killed, which is probably the most, I mean, the struggle to survive of the Franklin was probably probably no ship in history has been so seriously damaged and managed to survive. Her crew brought her back all the way back to the United States. Really, the top half of that ship was just completely gone.
Right.
So it was a pretty extraordinary. So that 13, I guess you could say, in a sense, she was unlucky to have undergone such a devastating attack and lost so many of her crew. In another sense, she survived. So maybe you would say that she was lucky. Most ships would have been abandoned and scuttled after taking that kind of damage.
This is what is referred to as an Essex class carrier, because the first carrier produced in this line was the Essex. And I think there were 20 odd of these carriers produced by the end of the war. And it really became, the central weapon used in the war, to the Marines.
Was that a wooden deck from Brad Washabaugh?
Yeah, I don't know if Bob wants to handle that, but yeah, they used wooden planking on the flight deck of these ships, and so you had wooden planking laid across sort of a thin steel plate. So these ships were not armored.
Yeah,
which is one of the reasons that the Japanese dive bombers and then later the kamikazes, when they were able to hit these ships, often they suffered really awful damage.
Yeah. So what I always found interesting of these Essex class carriers, the Franklin, as Mr. Toll said, was the worst damage, but didn't sink. But not one Essex class carrier was sunk during World War II. Several, like the Franklin, were damaged bad enough to have to be withdrawn, but never sunk. They had incredible fire control systems.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. Let me get to the next shot here. Bob, these are your BF-13 pilots, and I believe you're in this picture, right, Bob?
This is the ready room picture, and this was just before the flight that I got shot down. We were getting ready to go on that flight, and I'm way in the back there. with my head up against the bulkhead.
Yeah.
Is this you here? I'm circling.
Yes.
Yeah. I thought that was you. Libby had told me that. So what happened in a ready room, Bob? What did they tell you? What were you getting ready for? I suppose a flight, right?
Yes, the flight where we were going and what to expect and so forth. It's interesting that we didn't know they had the Musashi, so we weren't prepared for. It was just a ship as far as we were concerned. At no time in that ready room did we ever mention the Musashi.
Right. And we'll get a little deeper into the Musashi in a couple of slides. Bob, this is a series of photos that Libby provided. They're not quite in the order I would have liked, but let's take the ones with you. This is you in front of your Avenger up here in the upper right. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. It is, right.
Okay. And this picture here and the picture on the far left, that's you with your crew, correct?
My crew, correct. Right.
Yeah. So a crew of 3. What did the other 2 fellows do?
I had a radio man and a gunner.
Okay. Okay. And I know you've told me their names, but could you remind me of their names so we can honor them as well?
Yeah, the gunner is Pete Sanchez, and the radio man is Sam Platsky.
Right.
And
And these,
as an aside, when it was radioed to the skipper back to the ship that we had been picked up, years later, he said that, well, with the name Sanchez, Freligh, and Platsky, he said, that's my international entente. I knew who it was.
distinctive names for sure. And I'm sort of fascinated by this picture in the middle here with you and a friend, I'm guessing, enjoying some downtime in Hawaii. Tell us about that picture.
It's on one of the islands, and we took a break for one day and went into the island and had beer and sandwiches and so forth. So that's what that is.
Was that on in the Ulithi Atoll? Do you remember that?
I can't tell you what island it was.
Yeah.
Might have been Manus or something.
It was in Papua New Guinea. Yeah.
Papua New Guinea. Okay. Okay. Well, quite the strapping young man. You're how old at that time, Bob?
I was, let's see, 20,
21.
21, yeah.
21. Wow. Okay. So just to set this story up a little bit more, I thought I'd ask Mr. Toll to comment on a couple of things. I love this picture. It basically is the senior command of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, absent one man, and that's Admiral Halsey, who is not in the picture. But Ian, could you comment a little bit on the role each of these men played? I'm sure you know this by heart.
Yeah, sure. So second from the right is Chester Nimitz, who was the commander in chief of the Pacific Fleet, with his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, and then later moved his advanced headquarters to Guam. He was also the theater commander for the Pacific Ocean areas, which was the North Pacific, essentially the Pacific north of the equator. Of course, General MacArthur was the theater commander in the South Pacific. To his right is Mark Mitcher, who was the carrier task force commander, who commanded what was then Task Force 58. So he was really in charge of what you would call the kind of naval cavalry that Bob served in as an airman on a Essex class carrier. And on the left there is Admiral Raymond Spruance. He was the Fifth Fleet commander. So he commanded the whole. Basically, he was the big boss afloat. He was Nimitz's surrogate. The two men were very close. He had served as Nimitz's chief of staff. Earlier in the war, Nimitz had hand-selected him to take the fleet to sea, essentially with orders to make the big decisions exactly as I would make them if I was there. And then the fellow on the left, I'm on my phone, so I've got a very small picture. That may be Kelly Turner. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm looking.
No, I'm sorry, Ian. It's Admiral Lee.
Oh, right.
King Lee, they call him.
King Lee, right. So he was in charge. Another senior admiral who was a battleship admiral, and he was essentially had the administrative control of the battleships in the Fifth Fleet.
Yeah. And what I always found interesting, Ian, and I'm not sure our audience totally appreciates this, but at times when Spruance was in command, as we'll see at the Battle of Philippine Sea, he's in command of the Fifth Fleet.
Right.
He and his staff. And then the man who's not in this picture, who plays an integral part in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, is Admiral Halsey. And he's in command for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and they call it the Third Fleet.
Right.
But the only thing that really changed, it was the same ships, same senior commanders, other than Spruance or Halsey. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. In mid 1944, the decision was made to essentially set up a kind of a rotating or alternating fleet command, where these two very senior admirals, Spruance and Halsey, both 4 stars. Halsey would eventually receive a 5th. At that point, they were both 4-star admirals. Would essentially take turns commanding the fleet at sea. That was thought to be necessary because each admiral and his staff would then return to Pearl Harbor and plan operations for the next round of operations while the counterpart was at sea. So it was a rotating fleet command. And then the decision was made to just rename the fleets when that turnover occurred. So when Spruance had it, it was the Fifth Fleet. The carrier task force was Task Force 58. And then when Halsey came in, you would take the exact same fleet without changing anything in the fleet, just start calling it the Third Fleet. The carrier task force would then be called Task Force 38. And this was essentially a kind of a ruse to try to persuade the Japanese that there were 2 independent fleets operating at sea. And the ruse did seem to work at first, because we have evidence that the Japanese then were trying to understand where these 2 fleets were simultaneously, at least through November 1944. I think they figured it out.
Yeah. And Bob, from your point of view as a 21, 22-year-old fighter pilot, one, I'm sure you never got the chance to have lunch with any of these men.
We didn't.
But I'm sure you knew who they were.
Oh, heavens.
And when the fleets changed from Fifth Fleet to Third Fleet, did it make any difference to you in your day-to-day world?
No, not a bit. Not a bit. No.
And what was the scuttlebutt, as Sean would say, named after his scuttlebutt program, about these senior commanders? How did the 21 and 22-year-olds feel about these godlike admirals at the very top?
Well, we had greatest respect.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. And the reputation of Bull Halsey, Bob and Ian, what might you say about that?
Want me to jump in first? Well,
Sure.
Halsey was a charismatic figure who became very famous in the first year of the war, both in the Pacific and really among the American people. The press gave him a lot of attention. He was given this nickname, Bull Halsey. He loved talking to the press. He loved to, talk about what he was going to do to the Japanese. His kind of tagline was "Kill Japs, keep killing Japs," and so he became a very high-profile figure. In the middle years, he was the South Pacific theater commander, sort of a sub-theater command under Nimitz, with his headquarters in New Caledonia. And he sort of ran the fleet from a shore-based headquarters for over a year during the latter part of the Guadalcanal campaign, and then the South Pacific campaign that followed, and then was brought back to alternate with Spruance in command of the fleet in 1944. The problem with that was that Halsey had not commanded at sea for 2 years when he was brought back and placed in command of what became the Third Fleet. And of course, those 2 years, it was a period of just extraordinary, headlong progress and development, technological development, changes in doctrine. And so really from the point of view of the fleet in mid-1944, to look back at what the American fleet had been in 1942 is almost like you're looking back to the Dark Ages. That's how much things had changed. And so I think you could say that Halsey was not prepared. Halsey and his team, really, almost all of whom had served with him in that shorebound headquarters, they had a lot to learn. And so, you know, among aviators and subcommanders, certainly the skippers and the carriers in general, I think there was a feeling that Spruance was the more seasoned commander. And in the course of the war and the battle that we're talking about today, Halsey was exposed to some very damaging criticism for some of the decisions that he made. And I think that much of that criticism is justified. So historians now looking back tend to look at Spruance as the better fleet commander and see Halsey as someone who perhaps became a little bit too attentive to his public image and did not always make sound judgments while commanding at sea.
I've always sort of thought of Bull Halsey as a sort of Patton of the Pacific War. Some parallels there. All right. So this is the fleet. This is the carrier task force that Bull Halsey comes back to, right? He's gone for 2 years, as Mr. Toll tells us. And wow, it's a little bit underappreciated, I think, by many as to the vastness, the number of aircraft carriers, the number of fast cruisers, the number battleships, the number of cruisers, the size of the Pacific Fleet by mid-1944. To me, this is just an incredibly imposing picture. And I wonder, Bob, what was it like to see all these ships, all this power? Was that something you could even see from your point of view?
I had no idea it was that vast. When you line them up the way you have on the picture, it's impossible to for me to see when I was on deck.
Yeah. This is them lined up to come into the Ulithi Atoll, which was one of their rest spots, if you will, and replenishing spots in the Central Pacific. So that's kind of why they're lined up here in this picture. Most of the time, of course, they would be very spread out to help protect themselves, right? So, okay. So let's go a little more specific here.
Glenn,
Yeah.
before we jump forward, can we? There's a couple questions here in the chat.
Yeah.
The R&R that the gentlemen were speaking of, was that just for the officers or the crew as well?
Dad, that's for you. No. Then was the R&R just for the officer or for the crew when you went to the islands?
Oh no, it was for everyone. Yeah. You went you didn't go together, as I remember. The island, the officers went here, and the enlisted men went someplace else.
That figures.
At Ulithi Atoll, there was an island in the north part of the lagoon called Mogmog Island, and that island essentially was set aside for recreation. The Seabees went in there and they just rebuilt the place as imagine an island of maybe 600 acres covered with tennis courts, basketball courts, barbecue pits, outdoor theaters for musical performances and that sort of thing. And then one corner of that island was reserved for officers, and then the rest of it for enlisted men. And as Bob says, the liberties were kept separate. The officers were taken on a separate launch to their little corner of Mogmog, and then the enlisted men would go to their designated area. And when the fleet was in the last year of the war, you might have 15 to 20,000 men visiting that island in the course of a single day, just to get their feet on dry land and take a break from being on the ship.
Next question,
John?
Yep, from Mike Fink. Did Mr. Freligh do CPTP through college, or did he get all of his flight training via the Navy?
Via the Navy. That's the reason that I got out of the Navy, was to finish my college education.
And from Jeff Ballard, is quote unquote Lee Admiral Willis a quote unquote Ching Lee?
Yes.
Yeah, that was the nickname. It came from nothing. It came from way past in his career, maybe at the at Annapolis. Ian, do I have that right?
I believe so. Yeah. That was typical for officers of that era. They gave each other nicknames at the academy, and often those nicknames would follow them then for the rest of their careers.
Right.
And one last question, this we can get to later. Ian, this is for you. This is from Jeff Ballard asking, what book is the book that has not been written yet? This is from one Navy historian to another, but we can get to that later on in the program as we get further along.
That's a great question, but I would appreciate waiting till towards the end.
Definitely.
So I'd like to get now closer to Bob's experience and story. And the Franklin arrives in the mid-Pacific, ready for combat in mid-1944, I believe.
Yes.
Just in time to participate in the invasions of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, and then as part of that, the Battle of the Philippine Sea.
Yeah.
And so, Bob, you were on the carrier at that time.
And what you have to keep in mind is I am an ensign. That's about the lowest thing you can be. And they would say jump, and you'd say how high. And so there's no authority coming from it. You just follow whatever you're told to do.
Admiral Spruance didn't ask for your advice, did he?
Right.
Ian, if you could give us sort of a 2 or 3 minute briefing on the Battle of the Philippine Sea. This is now Admiral Spruance's fleet under Task Force 58. What inspires here, Ian?
Well, this was a battle that occurred during our operation to take the Marianas Islands, as you say there on the right of the map. Saipan, Tinian, and then Guam, which had been a U.S. territory for some half a century before the Japanese took it right at the beginning of the war after attacking Pearl Harbor. And so we were recapturing Guam and capturing these other islands to the north. We understood that that was going to be a critical kind of moment in the war because from those islands, the new B-29 bomber could hit Tokyo and the Japanese industrial heartland. And in the course of that immense amphibious invasion, first of Saipan, the Japanese fleet came out to contest the landing. And they came through the Philippines, through the seaways in the central Philippines, as the map indicates there with the red lines. And then launched three large air attacks on the Fifth Fleet. And it was the largest naval air battle in history up to that time. And it was essentially a slaughter. Our fighter planes shot down in the neighborhood of about 300 Japanese planes that had been launched from the Japanese carriers over the course of a 4-hour battle. And really from that time forward, the Japanese carrier task force was never able to operate effectively as a unit. It essentially did away with their carrier air power. Although they still had several carriers, they were never able to really train up another generation of Japanese aviators to sort of properly arm those carriers with aircraft and competent aviators to pose another challenge. So in a sense, this was the end of the carrier air war in the Pacific.
So it's sometimes referred to informally as the Mariana's turkey shoot, which I
That's
think
right.
pilots came up with. Bob,
Yes.
what do you remember about the Franklin and your involvement in these actions?
Well, actually, the Franklin got out there a couple of days after the turkey shoot, as I
That's
recall.
right. Yeah.
So, Bob, I wanted to show people, I think this is just a fascinating piece of history. Your flight book,
Oh, yes.
what Libby kindly
Very
shared.
valuable.
You still have it with you? I saw you and Libby referred to it when you and I spoke last week.
And Libby just put it in front of me.
Whoops, I thought I had a page of it. Well, so what was the purpose of this, Bob? All pilots, I'm sure, had this.
Each pilot had his own, and it was not kept by the pilot. It was kept by yeoman who put your flight time and any information that needed to be put in there to help you remember. And it was go from month to month. It would add up your hours for that month and carry it so that even now I know how many hours I flew total, how many hours each month. It's really something.
I have a couple pages of it here in a little bit. Okay. And of course, we didn't get into this yet, Bob, but I want to. This is a Grumman Avenger.
Yes,
This
it
is what you flew, right?
Yes, right.
And Bob, why were you flying an Avenger? When were you assigned that? Did you volunteer to become a torpedo pilot?
Whatever they needed, that was where they put you when you went into training. They needed torpedo pilots at that time, so I got assigned torpedoed planes.
Back to 21-year-olds don't get to choose what they're going to do. They just,
No, you don't. And if
Yeah.
you patrol bombers the same way, if they needed multi-engine pilots, they'd train you in multi-engines.
and you see here, like this obviously is a gun turret in the back, right? Where your
Yes,
one crewman sat, and imagine in the middle there somewhere is where the other
right.
crewman.
See, the gun is sticking out at the after port.
Yeah. And the other crewman in the middle.
And he's down in the bottom part they call the bilge. And he was in the bilge.
So you couldn't even see him. He's down below.
Right, he's inside, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where the radio man was, yeah.
Radio man. And what did you tell me, Bob? This was the biggest plane flown off a carrier during the war. Is that right?
As far as I know, right.
Yeah. And I think I have another shot of it here on deck. What was it like flying this plane? What did you tell me it was called? Big and slow, was it? Or some other words you used to describe it?
Probably like that, yeah. Low and slow.
Low and slow. That's it. So
Ask how, what it was like. It replaced the Douglas torpedo plane. That was the TBD, torpedo bomber by Douglas. And that was I flew it before, I flew the Douglas plane before the Grumman. And it was the difference between night and day. We were just so pleased to get the Grumman planes.
yeah. It's one of the aspects of the carrier air war in World War II. We kept updating all of our planes, improving upon the fighters, the dive bombers, the torpedo planes. Japanese had a little bit of improvement, but not near as much. They were pretty much flying the same planes they started with in 1941.
Oh, that's interesting. And I never knew that, yeah.
Do I have that right, Ian?
Yeah, basically, they did introduce a few new models, but by and large, they were not able to bring out a completely new complement of planes as we did.
Yeah.
In particular, their new fighters, they were not able to bring them out in large numbers, and so they were relying upon the Zero, right through the end of the war.
Right, right. Something Bob told me that I really was surprised at learning. So Bob flew the Avenger torpedo plane, but during the whole course of the war, Bob, you said you actually only had a torpedo on board 2 or 3 times?
About 3 times, yeah.
3 times.
We carry bombs mostly.
Yeah, that aircraft, the TBM was really designed to operate either as a torpedo bomber or as a level bomber.
Yeah.
So it could be configured for either type of attack. And the torpedo was really the most effective way to sink ships. It's how Bob and his airman colleagues took care of the Musashi in October 1944. They used to say, if you want to sink a ship, you can hit it with bombs to let the air in. You can hit it with torpedoes to let the water in. Better let the water in. And so, but that, after we essentially had sunk most of the Japanese fleet, then the Avenger was thereafter used more in the role of a level bomber, going in to hit ground targets on islands, for example.
Yeah, which you see right here in Bob's logbook, right? Strike on Iwo Jima, strike on Iwo Jima. Something about Saipan, strike on Yap, strike on Palau. Well, that's in anticipation, I imagine, of the invasion of Peleliu.
Yes.
So forth and so on as you go down his page. And all of those were probably bombing missions. Do I have that right, Bob?
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah.
99% of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And this is another Avenger pilot, Bob. You recognize who that is?
That's George.
He went on to maybe a slightly bigger job than you might have had.
Did he run for president?
I think he did. Yeah, that is Mr. Bush, as a very young 21-year-old Avenger pilot.
Yeah.
And,
in 42, they lowered the requirement to just a high school education. Up until that time, you had to have 2 years of college, but he got in as a high school graduate.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I believe he was the youngest. I believe when he got his wings, I believe he was the youngest aviator in the Navy.
I think I recall that.
Yeah, yeah. And
Question here from Rick, Mr. Freligh. What was your shellback ceremony like?
Oh, we had so many of them that, so many shellbacks that they didn't really do any damage to you. They just acknowledged you, and that's about it.
And a question here, I guess, about the flight log is from Mr. Fink. Are the AS entries anti-sub? He's used to seeing that as SNASP, snaps.
Where is that?
Oh, I see that. Character of flight on the left page, down one of the columns there.
Number 3.
Says A/S.
Oh, and a sub, anti-sub.
Yeah.
Interesting.
The Avenger was often used on anti-sub patrol. So just in an ordinary course of an ordinary day, these were not necessarily offensive missions. The Avengers would be sent out to orbit the task force, essentially, at a relatively low altitude, looking for subs. And so it was kind of similar to the combat air patrol, where you'd have the fighters, the Hellcats, up at higher altitude looking for planes, and the Avengers were then at lower altitude, keeping an eye out for subs. So this was a defensive, sort of an everyday flying assignment that you would have on a day at sea.
Let's get into the main event here. Time is marching on. We want to respect the time frame here. So this is a map of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And Mr. Toll, what I loved about your book is you refer to it as the battles, plural, of Leyte Gulf, which is absolutely correct because it's made up of several battles. And this map happens to show, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which we'll get into. Ian, what was Battle 1 about there?
Well, I'm looking at this on my phone, so the map is quite small, but I think you probably have one is probably the one on the left, right?
Correct.
So that was the first one that took place chronologically, the Battle of the Palawan Passage, it was called. Essentially, it was a submarine ambush. 2 American submarines, the Daughter and the Dace, ambushed the Japanese fleet as it was sailing into battle, and sunk a cruiser, 2 cruisers actually, I think. We got 2 cruisers.
Right.
And then a third one severely enough damaged that she had to turn back. So it was a devastating submarine ambush right at the outset of this sprawling 3-day battle.
And it pretty much also serves as an early warning that the Japanese fleet has sortied in mass.
That's right. The submarines were able to radio that contact report, and that alerted the Admiral Halsey and the Americans that the Japanese were going to contest this landing at Leyte Island with most of their fleet.
Right. And there's 3 Japanese fleets that get involved in this, and the Japanese seem to always be too complex for their own good, right? The main battle force is under this Admiral Karida, which is the force that is intercepted, right? And
that's right.
The third fleet off the coast here, right? Admiral Halsey in charge. The 7th fleet was headed by Admiral Kincaid, and that was referred to as MacArthur's fleet. That was the support fleet for the invasion.
That's correct.
So the main force is identified here with all these battleships, cruisers, etc., and they're going to sail through this rather complex chain of islands, very narrow in most part, and that's when Bob's action takes place here at number 2, and we call that what, Ian? The Battle of
the Sibuyan Sea. For what that's the there were a number of those kind of seas in there in that central Philippines, and the Sibuyan Sea is that body of water where that took place. And so we called that, essentially it was a sustained air attack on Karida's fleet, which ended up sinking one of the 2 super battleships, the Musashi. And so that's what we call the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea.
Right. Now, this is not the Franklin. This is actually the Essex on 22 October 1944. And Bob, this must look pretty familiar to you.
Oh, sure does. Yeah.
Flight deck full of planes. One plane coming up the elevator from the hangar deck below.
Yeah.
Preparing for a strike.
It sure did, yeah.
And so, Bob, as VF-13 is preparing for the strike, and you're in that ready room, what are they telling you? Where are you going? What are you expecting?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, they tell you as much as they knew at the time, and this is the job of the ACI officer, the Air Combat Intelligence Officer. And as I recall, our Air Combat Intelligence Officer, as a job before he went in the Navy, was a lawyer.
Wow. Luckily, he didn't charge you by the hour.
Right.
So back to this map, the carrier fleet is off the coast of the Philippines here, right? And how long did it take once you launched with VF-13 to fly from over the southern part of Luzon to where the Japanese battleship force was located?
It took forever.
Felt forever. Sure. And when you arrive, this is what you see.
Oh, that's the one.
That's the Musashi, right? I'm not sure you saw it from this angle, I'm sure.
Oh, I want to say that we didn't know they had the Musashi. It was
Right.
all a big surprise to us.
Right,
It was just a ship as far as we were concerned.
right, right. And it's not only the Musashi, another angle here of it, but it's also the Yamato.
Oh, the Yamato. Right.
Right. And Ian, what's the story behind the Yamato and the Musashi? They'd never been used in combat before. Do I have that right? Why did they choose to bring the two big battleships out now?
Well, I think essentially the Japanese understood that they were losing this war, and that there was a danger that if they did not get their fleet into action in October 1944, when we came back to the Philippines, there was a danger that they would not be able to get their fleet into action at all. And that was for basic logistics and fueling reasons more than anything else. The Japanese fuel supply was in the East Indies, today Indonesia. But of course, the homeland is where they were able to resupply ammunition, aircraft, newly trained aviators. And so they had this problem that the fuel supply and the supply of everything else that was needed to keep a fleet in fighting trim, those two places were 3,000 miles apart. And the fuel supply, essentially the story of the Pacific War, if you want to simplify it, is the Japanese had to bring their oil 3,000 miles north from Indonesia to Japan. And if we could cut that link, it would make it impossible for them to continue. Well, that was happening in 1944, and they foresaw that essentially there was a ticking clock here, and that they wouldn't even be able to get their fleet into action unless they seized the moment. So they were kind of forced to do that just to avoid what they saw as the disgrace of ending the war with the fleet at anchor somewhere, unable to go to battle. And so that was their reasoning, really, was get the fleet into action one way or another. This is maybe our last chance.
In essence, sort of becomes the Navy version of the Banzai charge.
Yeah, that's what I call it in my book, and I think that's an accurate, yes.
Geez, and I thought I came up with that thought.
I'm not saying I came up, someone else I think probably used that term before me. Yeah.
And Bob, you and your VF-13 group arrive on the scene. Oops, if I can get this to change, there we are. I found this in the Navy archives, in the National Archives, Navy section. This purports to be a picture of the Japanese battleships and warships maneuvering while under attack by U.S. carrier planes in the Sibuyan Sea. I don't think it's the Musashi and the Yamato. All it says is that the Musashi and the sister ship Yamato were involved. So I don't think it's actually that. But Bob, as you arrive on the scene, did it look something like this?
That's just about what it looked like. And what you have to remember is we didn't know that they had the second battleship, the one that sank. Well, both of them sank, but we didn't even know. They built it in secret, and
Right.
they covered over the area that anybody that was flying over wouldn't see the ship being built.
Yeah, yeah. So Bob, walk us through your story of your torpedo run. You don't really know it's the Musashi you're attacking. You've told us that.
All I knew was that that's the ship that we were going to go on. And what you do you make what they call an anvil attack. Everybody doesn't go in on the same. One goes in from the port side, one guy from the starboard side. So you try to get it in the middle of an attack, so that so that somebody's going to hit it with a torpedo. If it turns to port, they'll hit it. If he turns to starboard, someone is going to get a hit there.
And you're flying how far off of the ocean surface at that point, Bob?
About, I told you 600 yards, it's really 600 feet.
600 feet. Okay.
Yeah.
And
That's when you should drop your torpedo, right?
did it look anything like this? This is a painting done by a World War II artist, not about the Musashi, but just about the Battle of the Saboyan Sea.
This painting is much better than I would imagine it to be. It was just one big blur as far as I'm concerned. On the ship with the ship in the middle.
In Mr. Toll's book, I think the quote is, it looked like the 4th of July back in Michigan.
Yeah, right. That's right.
Except they're trying to kill you with the fireworks.
This is, and I really had that feeling before we went in on the attack, when they're shooting us and we're in the air circling to make the attack. Yeah, all these puffs of smoke and the smell and so forth was just like the Lenawee County Fair in Adrian, Michigan.
Hard for us to imagine what that had to be like. Impossible. So you make your run, and you release your torpedo.
Yes.
And you believe, I think you told me that your torpedo makes a hit on the ship that you're firing at.
My gunner can look aft and he can follow the wake of the torpedo, and the torpedo is going right toward the ship. So the last the last word that I heard was that boy, it's going right toward the ship. So that hopefully we got a hit at that time. Yeah.
All right. And then once you release your torpedo, kind of like this plane is doing here, you bank away sharply to get away from the fire.
You take evasive action is what they call, because they're firing at you. And you hope that you evade it. But unfortunately, I didn't.
Exactly. What happens, Bob?
Well, I got hit, and oil spilled all over my windshield, and I could hardly see. And the thing that I remember, and have remembered over the years, this fighter pilot coming alongside me takes a look, and he gives me the thumbs down, figuring that I'm not going to make it. I didn't need the fighter pilot to tell me that I wasn't going anyplace anyway with no oil.
So you know pretty quickly that you're going to go down.
Right.
How do you decide how you're going to go down or where you're going to go down?
Well, you don't decide where you're going to go down. You go down in a hurry. You don't have any evasive action to take, so that all you try to do is get away from whatever the action is, knowing that you're going to be all alone out there. So I tried to head toward what I thought was the shore, and proved to be right. So that,
but you land in the ocean just offshore.
just offshore, right, and away from the coral reefs. We were told that the coral is real sharp and will cut up your plane. So that's what I remembered, and so when I landed, I made sure that I was outside of the coral reef.
And it's a successful landing in the sense that no one's injured. Was one of your crew members injured somewhat?
Yes, the plexiglass in the bomb bay was shattered when we were hit, and the glass evidently cut up my radioman's hand pretty bad. It was bleeding, and so that was a concern of mine then.
And how do you make it to shore?
Well, I have a pilot's raft and a crewman's raft, and they couldn't get the crewman's raft inflated. But here I am with a pilot's raft that I got out. I'm sitting in the raft, really, waiting for my crewman to join me. And when they couldn't join me, and I learned that the crewman's hand was pretty well cut up, I thought, well, that salt water is going to really hurt this guy. So I put the radio man in my raft, and the two of us, my gunner and myself, towed the raft in toward shore.
And you reach shore, and what happens then?
Well, I have an interesting point. When you're my age, and a banca comes along with a young lady and two men, the young lady isn't wearing anything from her waist up. And all of a sudden your thoughts, whoa, wait a minute here.
You landed in paradise.
Yeah, right. I thought, oh boy, this is going to be something, a bunch of ladies running around without anything on in the islands. Well, that was, they were up to no good as it were, because when we did finally land on the island, all the ladies were dressed.
And do the Filipino guerrillas find you right away?
Well, they might have been guerrillas, but they were just ordinarily Filipinos. They took us, and nobody spoke English. They all spoke Tagalog, as I recall. But Mr. So-and-so, who has worked on a plantation, lives in so-and-so, not far from there, and so he came in the next morning and spoke English, and we were able to tell him what happened.
This is just a random picture of Filipino guerrillas on Luzon during World War II. Not the fellows that found you or were with you, but just to remind everybody, the Philippine Army had been part of I wouldn't say part of the U.S. Army, but they had been under MacArthur before the war. The Army developed by MacArthur. And once the Japanese take control of the Philippine Islands, there's just a very large and significant guerrilla movement, all over the islands. And you're fortunate enough, Bob, to have been found by these Filipino guerrilla forces.
You're right. We were told where the guerrillas were, but of course we didn't know where we were in respect to it and to where they were. But they got hold of us, and I will say this about the Filipinos: they were the most loyal U.S. People you'd ever wanted to know, and the nicest people.
Oh. And how long do you spend with the Filipino guerrillas?
Oh, I was with them 47 days.
All right. And this is your logbook where the yeoman here makes an entrance, which I found rather chilling, missing in action. All right.
Yeah, that's it.
Oh. So 47 days. How are you finally rescued?
Well, that's interesting, because the guerrilla forces were trained by the U.S. Army, and they were part of the Philippine Army. But when the Philippines went, then they joined this fellow joined the U.S. Army Signal Corps, and they sent him down to Australia to get training in all the action of guns and radio men and radios and so forth. And then they land him aboard at night in a submarine, and he goes up in the mountains and sets up an office, and he gets his lieutenants from the other Filipinos around there, and then they man this radio that they're in touch with General Headquarters, and I think it was in Leyte at that time. Could have been something else, but doesn't make any difference. So that when we were picked up, they radioed down to General Headquarters that our names and so forth, so that information then was sent to the fleet, and that's when my skipper said they got the name Sanchez, Plasky, and Freligh, all being foreign names, got them mixed up, and he said, well, it's got to be my international entente.
Yeah.
So that's when they knew that we were okay.
And you're picked up on the 47th day by one of these PBY boats, one of these seaplanes.
Yes, and it finally got an escort, a 4-plane escort of, I don't know whether they were Marines or not, but he came up with a 4-plane escort and was able to pick us up. What I'd like to say is, when they picked us up, they had the ship that picked us up had a bunch of supplies, and a bunch isn't the right word, but a lot of supplies for the natives and so forth. And they just offloaded onto their bancas, the native boats, and I thought that was a real good idea.
Yeah. So you're taken back to the carrier, or you're taken to
They're
some
taken
rest area?
Back to the sub, yeah. Back to the sub. And the sub had a ship that was assigned to it, as I recall. No. The plane, the PBY, yeah. The PBY had a ship that was assigned to it, yeah.
Okay.
Be a seaplane tender.
Seaplane.
That's-
tender,
There we go.
Right.
right.
And Bob, this is you receiving, I believe, the Navy Cross. Do I have that right?
I don't know.
Oh, we can't see the screen.
I received.
Are you seeing my screen now, everybody?
He's gonna
No.
help me just-
We're not right now.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's my technology lapse.
Yeah, there's my technology. Yeah.
So Bob, let me, this is you receiving the Navy Cross. Let me read this short paragraph, your citation. President of the United States of America takes pleasure in presenting the Navy Cross to Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Freligh, United States Naval Reserve, for extraordinary heroism in operations against the enemy while serving as a pilot of a carrier-based Navy torpedo plane in Torpedo Squadron VT-13 attached to the USS Franklin. In action against enemy Japanese forces during the Battle of Leyte Gulf on 24 October 1944, participating in a daring torpedo attack against major units of the Japanese fleet in the Sibuyan Sea. Lieutenant Freligh skillfully fought his plane in the face of the intense enemy Navy anti-aircraft fire, and although forced to make an emergency water landing after repeated damage to his plane by hostile gunfire, accurately launched his torpedo to score a direct hit upon a Japanese battleship. By his skilled airmanship, courage, and determination, Lieutenant Junior Grade Freligh could contribute materially to the success of his squadron in this important engagement. His conduct upheld the highest traditions of the United States Navy. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Gives me chills just to read that.
That's the highest that's the highest honor the Navy can bestow, short of the Medal of Honor.
You're one of our heroes, Bob. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Okay. So I want to watch the time here. There's 2 or 3 more points I want to get to, so I'm going to skip a few slides here. Okay. Ian, the Battle of Leyte Gulf continues while Bob is having his adventure with the Philippine guerrillas. Can you sum it up for us, maybe in 2 or 3 minutes? Sorry to be so brief.
Sure. Well, Bob, almost certainly his torpedo he dropped did hit the Musashi. Musashi took either 19 or 20 torpedo hits,
Wow.
and was sunk. These battleships, these super battleships, the Yamato being the other one, they were built to be unsinkable, and they were advertised as being unsinkable because they were so large and they had so many separate compartments that they could seal off. They had essentially, told themselves that there's no way you could sink these ships. Well, 20 torpedoes did it. And so the Musashi went down. That's a 70,000 ton battleship. she and her sister, the Yamato, are the largest warships ever built. They're about 50% larger than our largest Iowa-class battleship. So that was a significant event, sinking that ship.
That's all right.
The rest of Karida's fleet continued on, went through continued on through the central Philippines there, and went out by the San Bernardino Strait. Now Halsey, who's commanding the Third Fleet, is watching another Japanese force coming in from the north under Admiral Ozawa. You see there in the upper top right-hand corner of the map. And Ozawa's got the Japanese carriers with him. So when that force is sighted, Halsey is thinking primarily in terms of destroying what's left of the Japanese carrier force. And we did not know until later that that was a lure. The Ozawa was sent essentially specifically to do what Halsey, to cause Halsey to go north, to leave the beachhead off of Leyte, to destroy these carriers, which pose very little threat because the Japanese did not have either the aircraft or the aviators to make them into real threats. So Halsey takes his entire force north, leaving the San Bernardino Strait not only unguarded, but not even watched. So no one's even watching. And Karida comes through the San Bernardino Strait. No one knows he's there, and he descends upon the Seventh Fleet. That's MacArthur's Navy under Admiral Kincaid, and makes contact with the northern part of that fleet, which is a series of these task forces of small jeep carriers, CVEs, escort carriers, which are about half the size of the Essex class vessels that Bob flew from. And they're really not made for combat. They're more like service carriers for delivering planes or for providing, combat air patrol. They're not really geared for combat, so they are very vulnerable. And they are attacked by Karida's fleet, and really only through, blind luck. Karida decides to turn around before descending all the way into Leyte Gulf to attack MacArthur's fleet, and returns the way he came, and gets free and retraces his steps essentially all the way back down to their home port, which was near Singapore, and so that's largely the Battle of Leyte Gulf. You have the engagement down south, the Battle of Surigao Strait, when another detachment of Japanese surface ships tries to come up from the south to attack the American fleet off of Leyte, and is essentially annihilated in a conventional naval gunnery duel in Surigao Strait. And so the battle ends with all remaining Japanese naval forces retreating, and we went on to take Leyte, and then 2 months later, the rest of the Philippines.
Just a couple of other comments. That Battle of the Surigao Strait, I believe, Ian, tell me if I'm wrong, is really the last significant surface-to-surface, battleship-to-battleship, cruiser-to-cruiser action of the war and of history, as far as I know. Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is. It really is the last, major sort of naval gunnery duel in history.
Yeah, yeah. And back to this action era number 5, Karida's attack. There's some stirring stories, some of them recounted in Ian's book, but other books as well, about the destroyers and destroyer escorts and how we fought back against that fleet. And ultimately, Karida makes a mistake by retreating. Just this whole Battle of Leyte Gulf is one of the most fascinating naval battles ever, I believe, much less of World War II. So, and Bob, you're just sitting in the jungle, probably listening to some of it by that time. So I want to move to very quickly, Bob. If I could repeat just to save time, after your rescue, you're actually returned to the States for sort of a survivor's leave, rest and recuperation.
Yes, true.
But eventually you're being trained with another torpedo squadron to return to action in the Pacific.
When I came back from my leave, the 30-day leave, they asked me what I wanted to do, and I said, well, what's available? And somehow it came up that VT-13 was, that is Torpedo Squadron 13, was reforming, and I said, well, I want to get back with VT-13. So then I was able to get back with Torpedo Squadron 13 and train with them for 6 months, I think it was. About that time, we finished our training in the States and were sent to the Hawaiian Islands to await the first carrier that came back, and that would take us back into combat. Well, fortunately, the war ended right about that time. So, and I had a fiance and 2 years of college to finish, so I elected to get out of the Navy and return to civilian life.
And like many of the veterans that we've spoken to over the years and read about, had it not been for the atomic bomb and the 2 atomic bombings and the other events and the subsequent surrender of Japan, you might very well have been on one of those carriers supporting the invasion of Japan. You'd been offshore, right? And
I would say that's 100% right.
Yeah. I think we're all very appreciative of the fact that invasion never had to took place, because it would have been just an unbelievably terrible event for both us and the Japanese. So the fitting into this story, something I didn't know about or didn't remember until I started doing some research. In 2000, I'm going to get the date quite maybe wrong, 15, 16, the Musashi is found at the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea by a team of research divers, a team of people put together by the famous Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft. And I couldn't find, there's a lot of videos on that. I couldn't find too many still shots, but this is a shot of, I guess, a part of the Musashi at the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, which is really quite interesting. And I was reading something just the other day too, that about this same time, the USS Juno was found off of Guadalcanal, the famous cruiser where the 5 Sullivan brothers died, unfortunately. So they've been finding these wrecks. But what's fascinating about this is talking to Libby and Bob. This leads to, I think, an incredible event for our hero. There's a Musashi survivors group, as I understand it, that is involved in the finding the Musashi. And
it could be. Let me just interrupt here.
Yeah, please do.
It was the Japanese American Defense Association, of which these Japanese were members of, and the Japanese American Defense Association evidently got this reunion. It's an annual reunion of the Musashi survivors and their families, and they invited me and my daughter to come over to their annual dinner, and they asked me to say a few words, which I did, and I couldn't be more welcome at a place than I was at that night. The survivors, I think there were about 5 of them, 5 or 7, something like that, who who were at that dinner. And it was just, well, we were all survivors. So I was very pleased to be there. And my daughter went with me, so I was able to go. But I just went, they wanted me to stay longer and tour Japan and so forth. But I just stayed for the dinner and then came home the next day.
But what must have been just an incredible feeling, Bob, for you to share stories with the very men who were shooting at you and you were shooting at them 75 or so years earlier.
You hit it right. It was, and the feeling was the same on both sides. They felt the same way that I did. Very, very appreciative of each other, really. We'd been through the same ordeal.
Right. Well, that's the end of our story. Unfortunately didn't leave a lot of time for any more questions, but we have a few minutes.
We have
Sean?
the question. Yeah, we have the question from earlier for Ian. What is the book that hasn't been written yet?
Oh, yeah.
We have a note from Scott Masters in the room as well for an interview he's doing later, but we'll get to him in just a sec. But Ian.
Book that hasn't been written yet on the Pacific War, I guess is the question. Well, like every other aspect of World War II, almost everything has been covered. I think there's more work to do on the propaganda campaign that we and the Allies mounted, particularly in the last year of the war, to try to persuade the Japanese to surrender. I think it's a fascinating subject, really. I mean, this is a war which the hatreds were so raw, so intense, that it really took a real effort on the part of a fairly small group of Japanese specialists, the old Japan hands, as they were called, people who had lived in Japan, who had learned the language, who had served in the State Department or in other capacities, who knew Japan a little bit, knew the culture, knew the language, working in many cases with the Japanese American Nisei translators to try to develop effective ways of appealing directly to the Japanese people and the leadership to persuade them that the only real course was to accept unconditional surrender as the way to end this war. And that's a subject where, there are bits and pieces of that story have been told. I think maybe there's a good book to pull all of that together. That's one example.
Jeff also said it was the Solomon Islands, I guess more specifically, if there's a book that hasn't been written about them as well.
About the Solomon Islands?
Right.
Well, again, when you look across the literature of the Second World War, it's crowded. Or another way to say it would be that it's mature. The literature is mature. So I think there's always a good book to be written about various aspects of the war. If you just kind of do it better. I mean, the good storytelling, good research, there's always going to be room for that. But is there an aspect of the Solomons campaign where I would say, I look at it and say, no one has covered this? I don't really see it, no. I would say that there are just a ton of books out there, more appear every year. It's a crowded literature. And when I think about, what can be added at this point profitably, I think in terms of more the kind of the big narrative that pull a lot of different pieces into a coherent story.
Excellent.
Great. And over to Scott Masters. Scott, you're still in the room with us. You have something coming up later. If everybody in the room would give Scott your ear, please.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Just for anybody who might be interested, my students and I are doing an interview later this afternoon with an FSS vet, First Special Service Force veteran, an American who's 100 years old, who saw action in Italy during the war. I've been fortunate to interview a number of the Canadian soldiers who were involved in that force, and I've always wanted to interview an American. Two of the daughters connected and set it up for us. This man doesn't Zoom himself, but his daughter happens to be there to help him. So I just learned about this last night and we're doing it this afternoon. Those are the two guys. Charles Mann is the Canadian. You can see with the, well, they're both wearing poppies. And this is the American soldier, Eugene Gutierrez, who was apparently the only Hispanic soldier from the United States in the FSSF. So since it's going to be a small group interview, very last minute, I just wanted to put out the invitation. Sean, if you could maybe put my email address in the chat, and if anybody has some free time this afternoon, you'd certainly be welcome to join in.
Email is in the chat. Thank you so much, Scott. Anybody, if you're looking at the chat, you can email Scott for that Zoom link. We also want to give a shout out and thank you to our sponsors, DND Auto Salvage. You can find them at dndautosalvage.com, and tobacco-free Adagio Health. They are doing some great things in attempting to get people to be able to quit smoking. So if you're looking to quit, you could check in with the tobacco-free Adagio Health. And that looks like all the questions here in the chat. But Glenn, can I hand it off to you for closing comments?
Well, it's been a fascinating hour and a half, and I deeply appreciate Ian Toll's very generous contribution of his time to the Veterans Breakfast Club and honoring our hero, Bob Freligh. So thank you very much, Ian. I look forward to reading your next book. I think you said something on the War of 1812.
Yes, sir. The Battle on the Lakes.
Well, if you like, when that comes out after a bit, we'd love to have you on and talk about the War of 1812, if that's possible for you.
Terrific. Yep.
And finally, to Mr. Freligh, his two daughters, Penelope, who couldn't be on today, and Libby, thank you very, very much for sharing your story with us, Bob, for allowing us to question and probe and try to understand what you went through all those years ago. And you're certainly one of my American heroes, and I'm sure everybody that's on this Zoom call today. So thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to meet Ian Toll. I really look forward to it.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah.
Thanks. Terrific discussion. Enjoyed it.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. We will see you tomorrow morning for VBC Coffee Hour.